All right. Thank you, Brett, for framing that. Hi, Rachel. Good to see you. Hi, everybody. So, yes, we're hoping this is a facilitated conversation, but I couldn't resist the opportunity to start this conversation with Shakespeare because I used to be an English major and it's been a really long time since I've had a meeting devoted to talking about Shakespeare. So let's just go here. Bear with me. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can.
What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So I think that's the real issue here is we are talking about language. And some people say, well, you know, the thing is the thing. It doesn't really matter what you call it. And other people say, no, language really has impact. And we need to be really mindful about what the language we're using. So I did a quick thesaurus search for synonyms and antonyms and threw out some ideas of my own. And I just want to take a minute for people to read through these words and just notice your own reaction, if you have it, or your own associations to the various words that I have listed here. Threat, risk, concern, health, safety, hazard, menace, danger, security, vulnerability, safeness, strength, needs. My experience, wildly different responses to those different words. Obviously, we're not talking about menace assessment here. Don't worry, we're not going there. But just to kind of ground us in some of these words get at the kind of same circle of ideas, but evoke really different responses. So the task of our moment here, as Brett was framing, multidisciplinary teams often use different terminology to address risk, threat, and biopsychosocial needs assessment. This facilitated conversation will explore whether it's possible to create more inclusive terminology for assessments that could be understood across disciplines. And if I can just take for a minute my own kind of experience of coming into this field. I don't know, maybe 8 years ago, I'm a clinical psychologist. Proof that you can get trained pretty well as a clinical psychologist and not know what threat assessment is. So 8 years ago, I'd never heard of threat assessment. There was a White House initiative with 3 pilot cities to prevent violent extremism. And I was, for various reasons, very interested in that and attended a meeting at the U.S. Attorney's Office about this. And they were talking about threat and threat assessment. And I just kept sitting there thinking, oh, that is such a turnoff. Why are they using threat? Why don't they use other more normal words? And I even wrote a message afterwards to the woman who was heading that up saying, I think you got to look at your terminology because nobody's going to want to get on board with this if you're talking about threat. Well, okay, so then the next 8 years I spent realizing that, oh, threat assessment is a thing. It's a field. It's extremely well established and researched and understood and well thought out and described. And you don't just like talk about it in smushy other terms because it's a specific thing that means something. But I haven't quite let go of that lingering concern of like, you know, for me, walking into that conversation, it was a total turnoff. And we're trying to engage school partners, community partners, parents. I'm thinking about this bystander conversation of how important it is that bystanders feel like they can share information. And I even want to go back to what was said in an earlier meeting today as an example of a student who spent much of the day with their head on their desk, and that student was actually kind of moving on a violence trajectory, and that was a potential flag that needed to be identified and reported. And I was thinking, okay, would a teacher look at a student who looks just so sad and tired and think, I'll send that student to be reviewed by a threat assessment team? It just like intuitively doesn't work. On the other hand, would that teacher maybe think, boy, this student should be evaluated by the health team, or I want to share a needs and concerns assessment team, something about, I mean, I don't have the language, that's why we're all here, but I have the concern that we're creating barriers to engaging our community partners and making it harder for people to want to share about their kids, their neighbors, their peers, if we're using language like threat. So a few questions to consider, and I think what I'll do is and there are more, you can go beyond these. I just wanted to frame the conversation. I'll read these questions, then I'll drop them in the chat and turn off the slide so that we can put cameras on maybe and just have a conversation. But these are questions I had, and Rachel, you can jump in here too. What does threat assessment mean to you? What does it mean to the partners you want to engage? What is the risk, no pun intended, of continuing to use threat assessment terminology? What is the risk of not using this established terminology? Like, what do we lose if we move away from it? Are there ways to think about expanded language that better crosses disciplines and engages key partners? And what are the benefits of advancing new language reframing? And what are the risks of doing so? So, okay, let me stop my share there. I'll drop those questions in the chat, but meanwhile, it's open for conversation.
Yeah, so if I may, yeah, similar to Heidi, I had an exposure to this thing called threat assessment. Oh, and I'm hearing, am I coming through clearly? I'm getting a little feedback.
Yeah, I think one person just needed to mute and I saw the mute, so you should be
okay. As long as it's not me. Okay. So similarly, I mean, I came from a background in forensic psychology, got a master's in forensic psych, and thought that specialty training, especially as it related to risk assessment and psychological evaluations for the court, things that did involve typically like legal and law enforcement and maybe like a community mental health agency, that I thought that I knew what was out there. And then very similarly, in coming into my doctoral residency, my final year at Nicoletti Flater, I was exposed to this threat assessment world. And I found it very refreshing because my specialty in my doctoral program was in behaviorism. And it's very clean in the sense that we're not going to guess what's going on in a person's mind, but we can agree on behavior. And that's probably the closest that we can get to agreement about what's going on with someone. So we don't want to assume that, what's going on with a kid who has their head on their desk, because there are a million explanations. And until we have that conversation with that child, it would be really hard to know. So the behavioral threat assessment model that I was exposed to really just categorized behavior along a trajectory towards violence. And in that, it took away a couple of things. One is, this idea of profiling and trying to figure out who's most at risk, because that really has not panned out in the world of threat assessment or forensic psych, or, in Colorado, all the school shootings and attacks on location that we've had. These don't tend to be kids who have significant criminal records. In fact, a lot of them are fairly high functioning, well-resourced, and maybe entitled. And part of their grievance could be around a personal slight. And so just getting away from some of the risk factors that I had been exposed to, like criminal history, truancy, cruelty to animals, fire setting, right? Like psychopathy indicators and things like that. That is really helpful when you're dealing with a large scale program that maybe needs to triage people into risk categories or different tracks with different levels of resources, but it really doesn't tell you what to do with the individual. And so in this behavioral lens, I mean, I think we could call it so many different things, and that really does map onto how people think about it. But when I'm looking at a kid who is starting to have an issue, feels picked on, is getting angry, they may or may not see somebody out there in the world that resonates with their anger, their issue. But regardless, once kids decide that violence is the answer and they start moving towards that, that's what I want people to see across different fields. So, you know, law enforcement might talk about, you know, tactics and target hardening and countermeasures. A school might talk about like primary prevention, right? Diversity and inclusivity, and a code of conduct and code of ethics, and a school climate. And that there are things that are violations of codes of conduct, even, you know, short of criminal behavior. And then if I'm talking to someone in a mental health context, then it's almost like code switching, if I could talk about it that way. And so where I might talk about counterterrorism with someone who's in the FBI, I'm talking about the same situation, but I'm talking about interventions with someone at like a school campus. And yet the intervention, the countermeasure, would hopefully be a variety of things. And if we could just, I think, behaviorizing and operationalizing language helps us to not insert or put some added value or association on what we're seeing. So if we can just say, like, okay, there are indications of mobilization. This is a kid who has a plan, who is seeking out weapons, then let's just talk about the behaviors and go from there. Sometimes when we try to categorize people or diagnose them or do these things that our fields encourage us to do, then we lose the meaning when we're doing interdisciplinary work.
All right, I'm seeing a few great comments already in the chat. I don't know, I could read them, would much rather hear from folks directly though. So I don't know, Sammy, if you're willing to unmute and share what you're what you noted in here, we can just start going. And then Patty, Star, anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, I don't mind. Sorry, I'm trying to work Zoom. Okay, there is my video. Yeah, no, and this is something that you know, speaking of folks that are up in front of us, Dr. Nielsen did a really good job of explaining to our team. Coming up with a name for your program can be really difficult, because I found, and I know Patty spoke to this a bit, so I don't want to take that away, but even when we were naming our program, it was trying to strike a balance of something that was descriptive and told people immediately when they heard our program what it was and what it did, to give them a general sense. And that being descriptive enough to community members but not off-putting, but also descriptive enough to you know, agency partners, law enforcement partners, folks in the professional setting, also knowing what we do. And one of the challenges I've had, and I would say even in my role now, like supporting other threat management teams, for lack of a better word, is that I see folks use language like risk assessment teams and things like that to try to make themselves more palatable to community members, which makes a lot of sense. But then there are even difficulty with that as well, because when they engage with threat assessment professionals, it then becomes a question of, well, are you all doing risk assessments, or are you doing threat assessments? Are you saying those things are the same thing? They're not really the same thing. They're very different, but they can be complementary. So that can be off-putting to professionals that folks may want to include. I know someone made an earlier comment about getting the subject matter experts in the room on certain cases to engage with your team and try to build out your capabilities as you try to assess and manage a case and a client. And then I think that just the last piece is, someone made the comment, and I'll let them bring that up, but I came from a program where our team was called a crisis response team, and it was based on a crisis intervention team model. And I found that like language like intervention makes sense enough to everybody that they know what it means when they see it, for the most part. And it really sort of encompasses all the different things that we use. Because I think one of the challenges of calling yourself a threat assessment or threat management team is that, does that also mean that you only use threat assessment as part of your approach to mitigating and managing threats? Do you also use needs-based assessment, like you were saying, Heidi? or, you know, some other form. Again, getting back to risk assessment, violence risk assessment in particular, and sort of using all of these different sort of methods to come up with a holistic picture of what's going on with this individual as you try to manage and support them.
Thanks, Sammy. I really like your point that threat assessment can be an approach that's included as part of a set of tools or actions that's held by a team that can be named whatever you want to name it. You know, it could be a school health and safety team that includes a threat assessment component or approach within it. So that's a really nice way to maybe both keep the specificity of what a threat assessment is without putting stigmatizing language to it. Maybe we just keep going down the chat here. Patty, do you want to unmute and share your comment?
Aloha, thank you. Thank you for reading my comment. You know, I'd really like to piggyback off of the last one. It's interesting when we talk about the term risk. That's a really good example of a term that has specific meaning depending on the agency or the profession, right? And so it's important to acknowledge that different agencies not only might want to use different words, but sometimes need to use different words. So what happened here in Hawaii, I work at a fusion center. We started doing outreach to various agencies in threat assessment was what we initially called it. And we learned from our stakeholders that people have different needs, not only threats, but things like self-harm, suicidality, and also common threats of campus climate, among other things. And threat assessment, when people heard it, they didn't understand that this team building model could be used for multiple purposes, not just assessing threats in the traditional manner. We partnered with a state university, University of Hawaii West Oahu, who has a very advanced behavioral intervention team. And they likewise shared the same observation that people were thinking that this program might not be able to help them with some of their needs. So what we did was we coordinated terminology with that strong partner because they're such strong leaders in the subject matter. And we agreed we'd use behavioral intervention threat assessment so that we could be clear that we were including things that didn't just arise to the level of a threat. When Fusion Center does outreach, education, basic threat assessment training, or what we'll say behavioral intervention threat assessment training, I always include as part of the introductory presentation an acknowledgement that this behavioral intervention threat assessment protocol or model can be used for multiple different reasons that might vary from institution to institution. And I go ahead and I point out the limitations of some teams that I've worked with that require them to use threat assessment terminology compared to other teams that might have other names, such as Team Malama, which means healing, or Care Team. And I talked to the audiences about how this paradigm can be used for all of these different issues, and then kind of encourage them. Go ahead, pick your own terminology. And this is not intended to force anybody to completely adhere to any particular paradigm. Thanks.
Yeah, I like that. If I can make a couple of comments, yeah, I mean, one is who is the client? So that's a major difference between risk assessment and threat assessment. You know, in the Nicoletti-Flater model, at least, that I'm familiar with, that when you're doing a threat assessment, the person of concern is not the client. So the community or the business or the safety team or the school is the client. And we're using behavioral indicators to look at how close someone is to attack, and then design ideas around intervention and information sharing based on where someone is on that trajectory. So we don't even get into language like low, moderate, high risk, but that language is very much used like in criminal cases or sex offender evaluations or treatment plans for people who are court involved, where there's already a criminal history and something more established. With threat assessment, you're much more likely to end up with someone with no significant prior criminal history or mental health history. And so, you know, trying to take that individual and use a risk assessment lens to compare them to other people. The risk assessment instruments are really based on, you know, populations that may have this particular issue or be at risk of recidivism or relapse. And so a risk assessment is comparing one person to like the likelihood given a population of similar people, what's most likely to happen here. A threat assessment is taking behavioral indicators and plugging them in and then helping a team decide what to do about that individual, but we're not coming up with a treatment plan for them. So that's really the difference. And so, you know, if we're thinking about who's the client, I mean, it might be appropriate to call it a threat assessment, but are we losing buy-in or understanding? So, I mean, I am thinking of a case that we had in Colorado where the person who did not want to engage in information sharing around a case was the school psychologist, because threat assessment was off-putting and she didn't really know what it entailed. And rather than being viewed as, you know, a team approach to help this kid and to get as many data points as possible, so we're being fair and complete and making the intervention match the risk level, you know, now I'm interchanging terms, level of threat, closeness to attack behaviors, that this was really a team approach, and it was designed to help this kid to not get in trouble. You know, she balked and was like, no, I'm not sharing with you all because of confidentiality, and this is my client. So if we run the risk of either, you know, language being divisive because we're not speaking the same language, someone's talking about a safety plan and somebody else, you know, interprets that about, you know, safety plans, or another one where it's like, I don't know what that means until like I see it. That, you know, we need to think about the goal. We need to think about who the client is, and we need to think about who the audience and the team members are. So, you know, just like I was saying, I might say countermeasure with someone who's FBI or law enforcement. Countermeasure isn't going to work in a multidisciplinary team where that language is not used, and yet behaviorally I'm doing the same thing with this person based on, you know, their specific needs. But if I call it intervention and we call it behavioral assessment or behavioral case management, then I think we may decrease the silos and also decrease the defensiveness or fear factor even among professionals.
Thanks, Rachel. We continue to have really great comments and questions in the chat. Maybe I'll just keep going down and hope that we can get to everyone. And if in the meantime you feel like you want to jump in because it's more topic relevant to what's being talked about, raise your virtual hand or something like that, or your real hand if you're on video. Star, do you want to share what you put in the chat?
I think that it's really important for me to kind of stick with the industry standard, especially being a certified threat manager. So that means I'm a member of ATAP, and all of the research and all the things that, you know, the literature and a lot of things refer to it. And I think that describing what it means, I think that we can get into a real, like a rabbit trail, trying to make sure our language appeals to all people. And maybe it's more important, and from my perspective, to just describe what it is we're doing and why, because each audience might be different. And I think that trying to call it a bunch of different things gets really confusing to people. And ultimately, at least for now in the industry, it's called threat assessment, and it is different or differentiated from risk assessment. They are two different things. They're all part of, you know, a similar body of work. But so I just think it's better to describe what your mission is in the circumstance that you're in, because it is going to be varied, rather than get really hung up on the terminology and that sort of thing. That's for me.
And I totally agree. I just wouldn't want to lose someone in calling it threat assessment who would be a really key part of the team because they don't understand or they're not familiar, which is not uncommon. I mean, we're kind of a specific breed here, even within psychology and social work and education. And so particularly for people, for kids and young people who are in that gray space or are radicalizing or dabbling with concerning content, and I would say are engaging in concerning behaviors, not pre-criminal or attack related, but you know, more on the support side of things, that yes, they're acting out or doing something concerning that will draw us in, but the intervention is going to be care. That I wouldn't want to lose key people on that team by calling it threat assessment. And I read one comment that was like, well, do we do a better job of explaining, or do we change the terminology? And it's probably both, right? That we need to raise awareness and do some translating among fields.
Yeah, because I think about, you know, for us, we have a standardized approach. And so we use the Salem-Kaiser method. And my thing is at some point, and I agree, because the goal is to draw people in and work together. So, you know, for each person in their situation, how you accomplish that might be different. But I think about at some point, you know, like especially a family coming in and we're all sitting around the table, and then you start pulling out these forms and things, no matter what we called it before we get to that point, it's going to become aversive. And whatever we called it is now going to be paired with something aversive. And so I feel like putting my energy into making that experience less aversive, like front loading that parent for, you know, there are going to be a lot of people around the table, because it is a multidisciplinary team. And here's what our goal is. So that's kind of, you know, for me, because once I pull out that level one, it's called a level one threat assessment, and it's a standardized, and that's, you know, what we're supposed to be doing in education, not just winging it, but using a standardized format. And so somewhere along the way, that term is going to come up. So, but yeah, I mean, it is interesting, because I agree, you don't want to push people away. You want to draw them in, that we're here to help.
I'm thinking about, for many years, I've done work around mental health with refugees and immigrants. And what we came to understand was that saying, hey, your kid has PTSD or a mental health problem and we need to assess and treat, got you nowhere. But saying, hey, we really want to help your child succeed in school and there's some barriers to her success. Why don't we meet to talk about what might be creating those barriers and what we can do about it? And then you could talk about things like sadness as opposed to depression. And it was meaningful and worked. And I guess over time, what I've thought about is, yeah, you're right. At the end of the day, we might pull out an assessment and it says things on the top, but there's so much that happens before then. And we need this awareness of, you know, how can we use there's so much jargon in the field too, like to talk very concretely about what parents are seeing or what teachers are seeing, and thinking about the kind of common language that resonates with people, and trying to stick with that for as much as we can, so it's both specific and true and non-stigmatizing. I think, you know, maybe we can think about how to incorporate that in training for folks who are doing this work. David, did you want to jump in with your comment? That seems right on point here.
Yeah, just quickly, I was thinking, I think on our, I don't have much experience, but I find this conversation very, very stimulating around threat assessment, risk assessment, and so on. I don't have any experience in threat assessment, but what I'm thinking is whether the language we use sort of pushes us to think what services or service provisions we should offer or not offer, right? So does the language we pull and use direct me as a former social worker into an area of thinking or into an area of thought, and then that maybe leads me to services that I might call upon, and maybe others I don't call upon by the language I use and how I sort of conceptualize and frame my language, but also my thinking, right? So that's my kind of comment or question.
And I was dual tasking looking at the chat, but I think what you just said, if I'm hearing it right, I think is super important, that language also shapes how we think about things. So, to the degree that we're talking about threat and strengths and risks and needs and threat, I mean, if we say strengths in the process of what we're doing, it's going to force us to ask some other questions or think about a child or an individual differently. So I think it's both, how do people perceive what we're doing, but it's also how do we do what we're doing. So making sure the language reflects the range of what we need to be considering and doing.
Yeah, but I also like your earlier point, Heidi, about your work with immigrant communities and refugee communities. And I used to be a paramedic for a couple of years, and we were told to not use jargon with patients because they don't understand us. Mm-hmm. As a paramedic, I do this every day. I rescue people and use my skill sets and so on. But patients, they find themselves in an ambulance once in a lifetime. And so we really have to connect with them and use language that explains things well, but in a way that I don't use jargon and I maybe don't install further fear and further anxiety of being in an emergency situation.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so when you say risk assessment, it sounds more like that's more specific to the person or that person's risk of falling into some pitfall, some bad behavior or recidivism. Whereas threat assessment is, what is this person going to do to others, right? So I think even in that name, we're already insinuating that the priority is focused on this person's threat to others, which I think becomes a little problematic now in this phase of targeted violence prevention, because we're using a public health approach and more of a psychologically community-based kind of like savvy way of reaching people and hopefully providing support services, which is not what threat assessment sounds like. And yet that's the direction that DHS and law enforcement and definitely providers want to move into. So I find that this issue of language comes up just over and over. So in human trafficking and sex trafficking, or domestic violence, we've learned to not call someone a victim because that doesn't necessarily reflect their experience of where they're at with this person that they may have been married to, or as a boyfriend, as a protector of some sorts. And so it's distancing, and it basically says to them, you don't know what you're talking about by calling me a victim. And then, it's an issue of pragmatism, like it doesn't work. And so, when we talk to people about maybe you're in a toxic situation or things haven't been good lately, or how's the relationship going, then we at least have some dialogue. So, very similarly in the national issue across, violent extremism and counterterrorism, we're now using this umbrella term targeted violence because we realized calling stuff domestic terrorism doesn't connect with anybody who's actually doing the work. But in saying violence prevention and talking about racism in schools and concerning people who are trying to take advantage of our vulnerable kids online, then we get traction, then people know what we're talking about.
All right, let's jump back to Aisha. You had a comment in the chat.
Yeah, I guess I'm seeing both sides to the discussion. I really can agree with what David was saying around jargon. You know, we're not going to call up somebody who's a target and say, hey, you're a target. You know, that's very scary to hear. So just because we use certain terms amongst our teams and within our professional organizations and groups doesn't mean we need to use those terms when we're talking to folks involved in the process or with parents or with students. When I started working at the University of Iowa, we originally were a threat assessment team under the threat assessment program. And we had a conversation around, you know, hey, should we adapt this? Because we also work involving like welfare concerns, mental health, suicidality, self-harm, you know, it's just the whole spectrum. And that's helpful to open it up for all sorts of reports to come in, because you might just be getting a small piece of the puzzle. So you don't want to limit it to, hey, anyone who makes a threat, come to the threat assessment team. That's all we handle. And you don't want to, you know, put out that as your image. So I think it is really important to think about your name, because people might look at what's here at my organization, where can I go? They see threat assessment team, get scared, or say, hey, that's not me, that's not my concern. So they could turn the other direction and then not seek help. So I do think it's really important to think about creative ways where you can maybe wear different hats in different situations. So if you're dealing with a student or employee who made an explicit threat, they're aware they did, and you can say, hey, you know, we are under the threat assessment program and we just want to talk to you to see if you're safe, you know, to be in the workplace, what's going on. We want to hear, you know, your story and kind of the context around this statement. So you can explain it to them in a way where they understand it's serious and, you know, they did make a threat, but you don't want to come to a student who, you know, they were in their residence halls and their roommate reported concern because they had cuts on their arms, say, hey, we're the threat assessment team here to talk with you. So I do think it's important to maybe find a way to wear a different hat in different situations and use language based on that specific situation and adapt it in those moments. You know, working with law enforcement, the term threat assessment might hold more weight than up local law enforcement or the FBI or the Joint Terrorism Task Force and saying, hey, we're the assessment care team. They might say, who are you? You know, why are you contacting me? So I do think it's important for us to be able to adapt based on our audience. And I think it comes down to that, and also explaining what we do well. So, you know, I don't know the exact quote, but, you know, you should be able to explain anything you do in layperson terms so it makes sense to somebody has no experience, maybe thinking about how you can explain something that you do to a 5 or 6 year old. You know, we should be able to do that with any profession that we're in. So I do think it's important to keep that in mind.
Great, thank you so much. Elizabeth, let's get to your comment if you still want to chime in.
Well, I was just posing the question of whether it's easier to change the terminology or to expand on people's understanding, because I know there's a lot of people, especially people who've attempted to commit suicide or something of that nature, who come in and they feel like they're abnormal, or they have this they don't want to be in a category that makes them seem as less of a person or as a compromised person. And there's just this whole stigma of mental health. Like, a lot of law enforcement are afraid to seek mental health or help because they don't want to be stigmatized. And so perhaps bringing people's understanding up to a better level might be more appropriate, because then it would also lessen the stigma that people have in society over mental health issues and how important they are to prevent things from happening and to keep people safe and their well-being in good rapport. That's just my question, because it seems like it's more than just bringing people together into a team, but it's also about making it better moving forward for everybody involved. I don't know if I'm explaining it good,
Yeah.
or but that was my question.
No, I'm excited about this one because I mean, a well-functioning team is going to take time to build rapport and trust and understanding and appreciation. And, you know, when we started working through cases really on a more theoretical basis here in Colorado, we got the opportunity to listen to how everyone was thinking about it and talking about it. But, you know, the trick was first getting everyone on board. And so it is dawning on me that, you know, in my experience, you need to have the welcoming language or the welcoming messaging to get everyone together, and to then you kind of experience like, okay, what is this really about? What's the actual tone to things? But first there is some marketing and some, you know, description that's important just to get people in the room around the issue. And so again, you know, in trying to involve mental health and educational professionals here, the counterterrorism was never going to do it. Threat assessment is still a hard sell. If we talk about a multidisciplinary team, we're good. Collaborative management, which involves 10 different departments around juvenile justice, case management, mental health services, great. It is the difference between saying, you know, like mental health diagnostic screen and like wellness and resiliency programming. Even though the thing may be the same, what is going to get people in the door to even get an idea of like the power of this and the purpose of this? And that's even with professionals. Sorry.
No, thank you, Rachel. I know we're 2 minutes from the end, and you're never supposed to like bring up a totally new topic in the last 2 minutes, but I had this thought that I really want to share with this group because I feel very strongly about it. Another issue around language that we haven't talked about is I have seen person of concern, POC, used repeatedly in kind of threat assessment writing. POC means something also, person of color, and the idea that that acronym would be kind of used into like wildly different contexts but potentially misunderstood is really deeply concerning to me. And to point to David's comment about person-centered language, so youth in right-wing groups instead of right-wing youth, I think that's a shift that has been certainly playing out in the mental health field, you know, people with disabilities instead of a disabled person, and is really, really important to think about in this context as well. So without having, you know, the time to really unpack it, I do think POC is a term that we need to scrap and come up with another way of thinking about who are these individuals that we're talking about and what are they struggling with, and how can we frame it so it's really person-centered and human-centered and not overly and not stigmatizing. Point of contact is another one, same acronym though, wondering if we can get to a different acronym. Last comments that anybody wants to make in the last minute. This has been a really lively, interesting, great conversation. I thank everybody, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all the chat comments, but I hope you're reading them. Anyone have anything else they'd like to say here at the end?
All right, I'm going to ask everyone to join me in thanking Heidi and Rachel for leading this discussion. Obviously, this is the start of the conversation and not the end, but I appreciate everyone's input, and for the constructive disagreement is really important as we build this field together. So I just put the link to the survey for the network as a whole in the chat again. If you didn't have a chance to fill that out yet over the last 2 weeks, please do so now. This concludes our programming for today. Tomorrow, we begin the day with an informal coffee chat for anyone who wants to join early and just connect with other professionals in the field. We welcome you at 10:30 a.m. Eastern, 7:30 Pacific. And then our programming begins in earnest tomorrow morning with a joint plenary between the Prevention Practitioners Network and the Canadian Practitioners Network at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. Thank you to all of you for joining us today, and we hope to see you again tomorrow.